Let me read out aloud information to you today regarding this beast, shall we? Phaedra is the fifth studio album by German electronic music group Tangerine Dream. It was recorded during November 1973 at the Manor in Shipton-on-Cherwell, England, and released on 20th of February 1974 through Virgin Records. This is the first Tangerine Dream album to feature their now classic sequencer-driven sound, which is considered to have greatly influenced the Berlin School genre. The album marked the beginning of the group's international success and was their first album released on the Virgin label. It achieved six-figure sales in the UK, reaching number 15 in the UK Albums Chart in a 15-week run with virtually no airplay, only by strong word of mouth. It also earned the group a gold disc in 7 countries, though in their native Germany it sold barely 6,000 units. The album title refers to Phaedra of Greek mythology. On hearing a set of recordings Edgar Froese and Christopher Frank had made earlier in the year at Skyline Studios in Berlin, Virgin Records' Richard Branson offered the group a 5-year contract and was keen for them to record in the UK. A modular Moog synthesizer was brought with the Advance, and the trio arrived at the Manor in Shipton-on-Cherwell, Oxfordshire, in the winter of 1973. The entire album was recorded in less than 6 weeks, with the first recording session taking place on the 20th of November 1973. Some of the music was recorded with help of Froese's wife Monique. Interviewed by Mark J. Prendergast, Froese recalled, "Phaedra was the first album in which many things had to be structured. The reason was that we were using the Moog sequencer, all driving bass notes, for the first time. Just tuning the instrument took several hours each day, because at the time there were no presets or memory banks. We worked each day from 11 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock at night. By the 11th day we barely had 6 minutes of music on tape. Technically everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The tape machine broke down, there were repeated mixing console failures, and the speakers were damaged because of the unusually low frequencies of the bass notes. After 12 days of this, we were completely knackered. Fortunately, after a 2-day break in the countryside, a new start brought a breakthrough. Mysterious Semblance was recorded on December 4th. Pete and Chris were asleep after a long day's recording session, so I invited my wife, Monique, into the studio. I called in the studio engineer and recorded it in one take on a double keyboard Mellotron while Monique turned the knobs on a phasing device. This piece is on the record exactly as it was recorded that day, and this practice was to continue for the rest of the session." End quote. The title track was originally based on an improvisation recorded in the studio and unintentionally exhibits one of the limitations of the analog equipment unused at the time. As the equipment warmed up, some of the oscillators began to detune. They were highly temperature sensitive, which was responsible for some of the changes in the music towards the end of the piece. Both in the title track and Movements of a Visionary rely on Frank's use of the Moog analog sequencer as a substitute for bass guitar. Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares features Froese soloing on a Mellotron, which is treated slowly sweeping filter effects. Sequence C is a short piece by Peter Baumann on recorder, with tape echo. The sleeve design and cover painting are by Froese. And let's read about the style and reception. This tab here on the Free Encyclopedia. The All Music Guide to Electronica describes the album as a milestone for the band, as one of the most important artistic and exciting works in the history of electronic music. Phaedra is commonly cited as one of Tangerine Dream's best albums. I would say it's almost certainly their best, almost revisitable release, I think. If you want Tangerine Dream, you're going to go to Phaedra, I would imagine, for myself anyway. And is listed in 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. In the Q and Mojo Classic Special Edition of Pink Floyd and the Story of Prog Rock, the album also came in at 38 in its list of 40 cosmic rock albums. Writing in his 2000 Ambient Century, Mark J. Prendergast describes the title track. At over 17 minutes, it conveyed feelings of the cosmos, of giant suns exploding, of huge ocean movements, of mythological lands, of eddies and drifts, layer upon layer of futuristic sounds piled on top of the other until the whole thing climaxes in some interstellar void. I would like to read out aloud this tab on Tangerine Dream's own Wikipedia article, Their Influence. I think this is fascinating for those who haven't read this yet or don't feel the need to now that you're listening to it here. Tangerine Dream began as a surreal krautrock band with each of the members contributing different musical influences and styles before becoming a revered progressive electronic act. Edgar Froese's guitar style was inspired by Jimi Hendrix, as well as the avant-garde composers Iannis Xenakis and Karlheinz Stockhausen, while Christopher Frank contributed elements of György Ligeti and Terry Riley. Yes-like progressive rock influence was brought in by Steve Joliffe on Cyclone. The sample-based sound collages of Johannes Schmoling drew their inspiration from a number of sources. One instance is Steve Reich's music for 18 musicians on parts of Logos Live, and the track Love on a Real Train from the Risky Business soundtrack. Classical music has had an influence on the sound of Tangerine Dream over the years. Giorgi Ligeti, Johann Sebastian Bach, Pierre Boulez, Iannis Xenakis, Maurice Ravel, Arcangelo Corelli are clearly visible as dominant influences in the early albums. A Baroque sensibility sometimes informs the more coordinated sequencer patterns, which has its most direct expression in the La Folia section that comes at the very end of the title track of Force Majeure. In live performances, the piano solo is often directly quoted from romantic classical works for piano, such as the Beethoven and Mozart snippets in much of the late 1970s, early 1980s stage shows. In the bootleg recording of the Mannheim Mozart Saal Concert of 1976, Tangerine Tree Volume 13, the first part of the first piece also clearly quotes from Franz Liszt's Totentanz. The first phrase is played on a harpsichord synthesizer patch and is answered by the second half of the phrase in a flute voicing on a mellotron. During the 1990s, many releases included recordings of classical compositions, Pictures at an Exhibition on Turn of the Tides, Largo from Xerxes on Tyranny of Beauty, Symphony in A minor by J.S. Bach, and Concerto in A major, Adagio by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, both on Ambient Monkeys. What a title. Since the 1990s, Tangerine Dream have also recorded cover versions of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze, first on 220-volt Live, and the Beatles' Eleanor Rigby, back in the USSR, Tomorrow Never Knows, and Norwegian Wood. As an infrequently recurring non-musical influence on Tangerine Dream and Edgar Froese in particular have been 12th to 19th century poets. This was first evident on the 1981 album Exit, the track title Pilots of the Purple Twilight being a quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Locksley Hall. 6 years later, the album Tiger featured poems from William Blake set to music, and around the turn of the millennium, Edgar Froese started working on a musical trilogy based on Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed in 2006. Most recently, the 2007 album Madcap's Flaming Judy features more poems set to music, some again from Blake, but also, for example, Walt Whitman. Pink Floyd were also an influence on Edgar Froese and Tangerine Dream, the band in its very early psychedelic rock band phase, playing improvisations based on Pink Floyd's Interstellar Overdrive. Madcap's Flaming Judy is dedicated to the memory of the late Syd Barrett. The title refers to Barrett's solo release, The Madcap Laughs. The band's influence can be felt in ambient artists such as Deep Space, The Future Sound of London, David Christian, and Global Communication, as well as rock, pop, and dance artists such as Porcupine Tree, M83, DJ Shadow, Ulrich Schnaus, Cut Copy, and Kasabian. The band also clearly influenced 1990s and 2000s trance music, notably Chicane. Both Offshore and Sunstroke borrow heavily from Love on a Real Train, where lush soundscapes and synth pads are used along with repetitive synth sequences, much like in their 1975 releases Rubicon and Ricochet, as well as some of their music from the early 1980s. The group have also been sampled countless times, more recently by Recoil on the album Subhuman, by Sasha on Involva, and on several Huzan Suzuki albums. This is not cited, actually, but a citation is needed, I guess. Michael Jackson also cited Tangerine Dream as one of his favourite bands, especially for their 1977 soundtrack to Sorcerer. It's a brilliant film by William Friedkin, of course. If you haven't heard Tangerine Dream's Phaedra yet, if you have an idea of what music Tangerine Dream delivers, that'll be your gateway into knowing whether you'll enjoy this album or not. And this is a great discovery piece of Tangerine Dream. Don't necessarily expect your moments, your times of Tangerine Dream afterward to be as interesting as Phaedra, or the times you listen to Phaedra after. Thanks again, my friends. Appreciate it.